This is CheloniaCast, episode 60. Today we're joined by Dr. Kristin Berry, who's a research wildlife biologist at the USGS Western Ecological Research Center. Prior to her time with USGS, Dr. Berry served a variety of roles working with the Bureau of Land Management based out of California. She has an extensive career working with sort of the biology, ecology, and conservation of desert tortoises, predominantly in the Mojave Desert, but sort of across their entire range. She's a founding member of the Desert Tortoise Preserve Committee and Desert Tortoise Council, both groups dedicated to the conservation and preservation of these incredible animals. In 2019, she was awarded the Turtle Conservation Appreciation Award by the IUCN Tortoise and Freshwater Turtle Specialist Group, and the Kristin H. Berry Annual Award presented by the Desert Tortoise Council to folks doing incredible work with these tortoises is named after her. So we're really excited to have you on, Dr. Berry. Thanks for joining us today. Excited to talk to you about some of your work.
All right, so Dr. Berry, if you're familiar with how we run things, we usually start with this question, which is pretty straightforward, which is just what kind of first got you interested in turtles and tortoises as a whole?
What would you repeat? What kind of?
Just like what sort of experiences got you first interested in turtles and tortoises?
Well, when I was a child, we lived right on the edge of the Mojave Desert, and I lived on the edge in different houses up until the time I left for college. And so my dad brought home a tortoise that he had saved from under a bulldozer when I was about 8. I could have been a bit younger, but we had tortoises when I was growing up. And I always thought that they belonged in the desert rather than in someone's yard. And a lot of the people in the same town where I was living had tortoises because they were right there. And so they were picked up off the road and they were rescued and that sort of thing.
That's really
yeah. I guess when we're talking about like your interest or specialization in desert tortoises as a whole, is I guess what aspects of desert tortoises do you find most interesting? Because obviously they're pretty unique from an ecological and conservation standpoint.
Well, that's a tough question because I've done work on genetics and on health. And I'm currently still working on health and toxicology. I have I have 4 demographic studies underway right now that are over 40 years old. And so I'm hoping to get those finished and published in the next couple of years. What I have enjoyed greatly is watching them, doing a behavioral study with a team of people who work for me. And we each are assigned a tortoise for a day, and from dawn to dusk, from the time they're still in the burrows until the time they come out, we track them. And one of the kind of fun situations is if you haven't tracked that particular animal before, what it may do is come and sit with you for a while. Find out, it's almost like, what are you doing? And what are you doing here? But after that, then you're allowed to track them if you stay 20 feet, 30 feet or more back. And you can watch them get into interactions with the opposite sex or big fights. They're very aggressive. Mm. So I still have to write that up, but they have quite a fancy social hierarchy.
That'll be something that will be interesting to sort of dissect in a bit, but I'm thinking about just your sort of early career and research and maybe your experience at Stanford and UCLA and working in school. What was that like? I mean, that was, you interacted with some really interesting people, I'm sure, and have some stories from that. I mean, what was it like sort of getting into the research world?
Well, at that point, I wasn't sure whether I wanted to be a doctor, a medical doctor. I very much enjoyed working with animals, but I quickly learned that I'd much prefer to be working with a vertebrate rather than an invertebrate. And so my first 3 years of college were at Occidental College. And then I left when I got married and went to Stanford. And that's not something I would recommend for people to do, is to change in their senior year, move to a different school, because there are all sorts of different requirements. And there was an animal behavior course that was outstanding at Stanford. And of course, Dr. Ehrlich and the population bomb author was at Stanford, and he was very, very interesting professor.
That's fascinating.
What I really enjoyed was going to Berkeley, far more than any of the other schools. The professors were there to teach, and they were in the labs, and they were in the field trips. For vertebrate zoology, we had a Saturday field trip for a full semester, and I was a TA for that. But the professors would join those, and we would have small groups of 10 people, and they were just there. They were there to help and to answer questions, and they were not so remote as at UCLA or at Stanford.
Who were some of the early influences you had at Berkeley, perhaps?
Well, Robert Stebbins,
Wow.
he was my major professor, and also on my committee was Starker Leopold, the son of Aldo Leopold. And I took his wildlife course, and it was in many ways the easiest course I've ever had, because everything he said made so much sense. And he was very closely aligned with how do you manage animals in an anthropogenic setting, and how do you maintain, say, upland game in an agricultural setting. And so he worked on those kinds of situations, and the focus on solving problems was a big one with him. And I've also been very interested in plants from the time I was an undergraduate. And I made it my practice to try to learn every single one of the desert plants, not just the shrubs, but the grasses and the annual plants, which are so much a part of the ecosystem. So I took botany courses too, and taxonomy courses.
Yeah, I imagine sort of the holistic understanding of ecology and botany is useful for sort of understanding a specific animal like a desert tortoise and how it interacts with its environment.
Yeah, or it's an herbivore, and so if you don't know what it's eating, you're really missing out on numerous exciting issues and how it survives. So I always wanted to take an entomology course, but that just wasn't in the cards. There wasn't time for that.
Right. Well, so and And you originally your thesis wasn't on desert tortoises. So how did you get involved with the research of desert tortoises specifically?
Yes, I really like lizards. I still very much like lizards. But I was asked by Dr. Glenn Stewart at Cal Poly Pomona if I would be interested in working on tortoises, and this was before I finished my PhD. He had been approached by the Division of Highways, which is now the California Department of Transportation, and they wanted to move tortoises out of the path of a widening roadway to a 4-lane highway. And he said, Kristin, you're the only one that can get involved with this because you've worked with an herbivore, the reptilian herbivore, the chuckwalla. And so this is one for you. And they'd already had their minds made up that they weren't going to fence the highway. And so I started looking for places where these tortoises could be put successfully in the strip along the highway. And that's when I became aware of how much the land was divided and fragmented with different uses, different land ownerships, and how there wasn't going to be any area that was really safe for the tortoises. So that stimulated me to think about trying to get a natural area established. And of course, the biggest landowner at that time was the Bureau of Land Management. And so I approached them, and they said, sure, you can have a square mile. And I said, that won't do it. And I asked them, how do I do this? And they said, well, get about 25 letters from important people and put in a proposal. So I put in a proposal, and I got about 75 letters. And finally, their state office wildlife biologist came down to the desert and said, what do we have to do to stop having these letters come in from Dr. Stebbins and Stark and Leopold and so on and so on. And I said, well, we need a natural area and we need a big one. And so that was how it started.
It's interesting. And yeah, the desert tortoise natural area in particular is something. I'm originally from California and spent a lot of time really growing up there and experiencing the wilderness there, the desert there, and the tortoises. Maybe to jump back a little bit more broadly with respect to Mojave desert tortoises, and it's a good distinction to make as there's now 3 separate species in the Western North America. But with Mojave desert tortoises, you've got an interesting perspective because you've seen them sort of the densities and the numbers change over time from kind of those early times we were working in the 1970s and 80s and such to the present time and in between. I'm curious, what did the tortoise densities look like in the past, and how does that compare to the present?
Oh, 150 to 300 per square mile. And if you went out to a site in the desert that wasn't too heavily disturbed, you could find one on a spring day if it was in the morning. Generally, it's harder to find them in the afternoon, though some of them come out and are available in the evening. But they come out in the morning, they bask, and depending on the heat level, for instance, in the late spring and May, they may not show up, or they may show up at 5 a.m., 6 o'clock, and they're in retreat by 9 o'clock in the morning. And so you have to know when they're out. But when they're out, and if it rains, if there's a light rain or a heavy rain, they all come out. And so you can see masses of them at one time out to drink. If you drive the roads, the dirt roads, you could see 10, 12, 13. On one trip to the natural area where I took Dr. Stewart and James St. Amant from the California Department of Fish and Game and a number of other people, you could see 8 at a time standing in one place. Then if you were standing in another place, you might not see any. So it was a very exciting time. And in those very early years, I did not expect the numbers to diminish so quickly. I thought we had a lot more time to conserve and protect, but that wasn't the case. Everything moved very fast, but you could see when I was first working with the Division of Highways, you could see all the problems that existed that were going to lead to the demise of the species in the wild and into viable populations. And of course, now we have very few viable populations of tortoises in the geographic range.
Yeah, I think that's what's so hard about conserving turtles with the, I guess, the niche and home ranges that tortoises have is it's much more feasible when we think of conserving freshwater turtles. There's public waterways and things of that nature. As long as there's some amount of shoreline, a lot of times they can fare much better. When you have a terrestrial animal with miles of home range, that fragmentation really just hits them so hard.
Yeah, they actually have most of them have a well-defined home range and have fidelity to burrows. It's not like the gopher tortoise that has these tremendously deep burrows, but tortoises have a burrow that is deep and that will be an adequate retreat from the heat and from the freezing temperatures of winter. Because in the Mojave, we have up to 120 freezing days a year, depending on the region. There are places in Nevada that have those cold temperatures. In the Western Mojave, where the natural area is, it's about 80 freezing days a year. And of course, as time goes by, it will be fewer freezing days. And then in the Western Sonoran Desert, that's part of the geographic range in California, often called the Colorado Desert, it's a lot warmer, and so there may be 2 to 14 freezing days a year.
Right, talking about the movement ecology of desert tortoises that Paul and you've brought up, it's an interesting thing that you've studied this a bit, and it seems like they all kind of have individual movement patterns. There's no two that are alike in terms of their home range size and sort of how they disperse and that sort of thing. I mean, what have been the most interesting experiences you've had studying desert tortoise movement ecology?
Well, I think it was the study of the social behavior, because the very large home ranges are held by the dominant males. And the females have home ranges that generally, depending on what part of the desert one's in, they don't overlap that much. And so there is quite a range in size. And for a young male that is getting into encounters, aggressive encounters with a much larger tortoise, there's a lot of movement. And he may be seeking out places for his home range. The small tortoises have small home ranges, and we know that from the work with the head starting and then release of the juvenile tortoises.
And sometimes desert tortoises will go on these long transient migrations. And I mean, what instigates those migrations, and how long are they typically gone, and why are they doing that?
Well, I haven't found that to be common. The long trips are more typical of the Sonoran desert tortoise, where they go from one mountain range to another and lay eggs and then come back, or they're doing something like that and they come back. But we do have instances of animals that have moved 3-4 miles, and they appear to be natural movements, but they're the young adults or the very large immature tortoises. Now, if you translocate them, we had movements as much as 14 kilometers, but it was a long distance mitigation driven translocation. It wasn't an over the fence type or short distance translocation. And they appeared to be headed, many of them, for home.
It's interesting to highlight the distinction between the Sonoran desert tortoises and the Mojave desert tortoises, and that's a fairly recent, at least taxonomically, sort of accepted distinction. And I'm curious, what other differences in sort of their morphology and ecology are do you see between the two different species?
Well, if a person hands you a Sonoran desert tortoise but doesn't tell you that it's a Sonoran desert tortoise, the only way you're going to find out is to know where it was found. That's number one, its location, and then its DNA, because they look very, very similar. I think the F. goodii, the thorn scrub tortoise, looks more different, and some of them have an orange eye color. So I think morphologically it's going to be tough. You're going to have done a lot of work with both species, or all three species, to be able to say with any certainty that you are dealing with one species or another. But in terms of their ecology, there's quite a bit of difference. And the desert tortoises are found generally in the creosote, white burr sage, Joshua tree, and other tree yuccas. And they are on the valley floor and on the slopes of the mountain ranges. Some get into the rocks, but really it's a relatively low density situation. In contrast, the Sonoran tortoises live in a different vegetation type. The Palo Verde, saguaro communities, and they're on the steep slopes. They are a rock-dwelling tortoise, and they take longer to reach adulthood. Now, I'm not sure that we know that as well as we need to know it. They have to be a larger tortoise before they start to lay eggs. But the more we learn about the Agassiz desert tortoise, I prefer Agassiz because it's found in both the Mojave and in the Colorado desert.
Right.
So the Agassiz desert tortoise can start laying at slightly over 180 millimeters in carapace length. straight line carapace length. Though there's some indications that some populations aren't going to lay eggs until they're about 208 millimeters in carapace length. So I think there's a lot left to learn on that subject for all of the three species.
I just wanted to go back just a little bit to what we were talking about with translocation of tortoises. Do you think maybe you could go into some detail about the impact that it has on local tortoises when tortoises are moved into their area, like foreign tortoises?
Well, the situation where I studied was south of Fort Irwin, and then I had 158 tortoises from adult tortoises from Fort Irwin to move, and they were moved to sites that were specified by other people, and some of those sites were not good places to put them. So we had a very high death rate. And out of the 158, we had about 26, 27 left alive after 10 and a half years. Now, there's been better success for the short distance translocation. And I was not involved with these studies, but there's a group called Conservation Partners that was, and they found no differences after, I think it was between 2 and 5 years, depending on the type of study that was done between the residents and the translocatees. But we had residents dying on the Fort Irwin project. So our animals that were to be the references or the controls died too at a very high rate. So it was not what I would call, and using the definitions for what catastrophic means for a turtle, it was not a successful translocation.
Did you find it very apparent what the leading causes of death was, or was it just something where resources weren't available because of availability and displaced tortoises?
It's a good question. It was a mix, but generally we had a lot of deaths from coyotes, and there were also dog packs there. We didn't see them until the end of the project, but they were killing tortoises. We had one that died from what appeared to be a golden eagle death, two actually from vehicles. And so there was some overheating and exposure. But overheating was a big issue for a few of them. But if one looks at percentages, it was predation. They just didn't have a home site, a deep burrow home site that could be resistant. And they spent more time above ground in the early years.
I mean, to someone that's sort of looking at the desert compared to the heterogeneous habitats that you get, at least visually in the southeastern U.S., there's sort of a mix of types, and the contrast between where you are is great in terms of height and vegetation and that sort of thing. But the desert looks sort of homogeneous, but at a finer scale, there's a lot going on, and differences in human impacts and different associations of plants and sort of everything in between. So it's interesting you point out that the translocation may be dependent upon where you're moving tortoises, where they came from and where they're going. And when you think about those questions of sort of how to quantify the impacts of an environment on tortoises that are moved or just there already and how they're doing? I mean, what are some of the metrics that you're looking at?
Well, I think movement is one of it, and whether they're eating, whether they're changing, whether they're losing weight, whether they show signs, clinical signs of disease, starvation, dehydration, abnormal behaviors. So those were the focus of what we were doing. And we just published one of 3 papers on that, and that was on the survival. But there were some tortoises that settled. And what we found was if the release site was closer to the initial home range, there was greater survival than if the tortoise was moved a great distance. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I think that they have to be put in a place where the soil is easily diggable, so they can dig a burrow and dig a burrow quickly. Because let's say, for example, you release a tortoise in the early spring when it's starting to warm up in March or in April, they've got 4 weeks at most to get a deep burrow before the hot temperatures come in May. Those are some really hot temperatures. And I think that's a very important point. Another is the food supply. Are they being placed in an area where it's a dry spring or there's a drought, or whether the wildflowers are blooming? Another key point is what kind of terrain are they going to be walking across? And were they placed in an area with a lot of small rocks that are hard to walk across, like a stream bed that is filled with cobbles? So the ability to walk and ability not to get flipped by walking on a steep slope, that sort of thing, those are important aspects to consider. And I think it's different for each species. One has to look at the potential stressors in the habitat. You don't want to release them near a road. Yet, if they're going to walk 14 kilometers, maybe the road should be fenced. And they were on the Fort Irwin project. But what they didn't do in the beginning was they didn't fence Fort Irwin to prevent the tortoises from returning. And so we had some animals that returned home, but then we weren't allowed to track them on the base. So we don't know whether they got back to their original home site or if they were just in the habitat with which they were so familiar.
Interesting. Yeah. And so, yeah, right. There's a lot of factors to consider, and it is sort of place dependent, and you want to have a lot of thought that goes into that sort of thing. Maybe we can.
Well, there's one other thing I should bring up, and that is we, in the Fort Irwin project, we recognized that predation was by coyotes or canids was a very serious issue, but we hadn't surveyed the area for canids. We'd not considered that issue. And so that's something that is considered now. Ravens kill adult tortoises too. And so where were the raven concentrations? And I think that you learn from each one of these studies exactly what you should have done, as well as what went right with your choices of attributes to study. But it helps to be on site, to be tracking the animals, and to be making observations. There's nothing like observation to help you design a study and to design a better study for your next project.
It's a really interesting point. I've worked with southwestern pond turtles on Southern California coast, so the other native Southern California turtle. And it's sort of what you're saying. It's definitely what I've been thinking, just kind of verbalized, is like, you can go out you can be armed with all of the analytical tools to solve a problem and have no idea what you're looking for. You have to actually go out and kind of get an idea for what are the things that matter, what are the variables you want to measure. So it's really interesting.
Well, it's almost like you need a year of your first part of your study where you may not end up using much of the data. You will be redesigning your project. And I think that was true at the Desert Tortoise Research Natural Area. We started out mark recapture tortoises, and then 6 years into it, we thought, well, we have to start measuring the predators. We have to find out what's going on there because the ravens are killing the juveniles. And so we started counting ravens, and we started locating and recording where the coyote burrows and the kit fox burrows were, and the badgers, and all of that. And so we kept adding parts. And then when the disease showed up, we developed the health program. And so, but it was a long study. I mean, we're still at it with 40 years later with many of these projects. So you learn, but you can also learn a lot from what other people have done. And that can be helpful to you.
Right.
Yeah. So you've had the opportunity, I guess, to monitor these tortoises over a decent period of time, at least compared to most studies. I guess I think it was probably fairly obvious from the beginning that things weren't trending well. But when we think of that, what were some of the most prominent signs that things were changing and decline was happening?
Another very good question. And if I hadn't been so interested in the flora, I wouldn't have recognized right away what livestock were doing to the desert. They were really changing the structure of the vegetation, and they brought with them weeds, the weedy grasses. And it turns out tortoises don't thrive on grass. It's they'll lose weight. To process it, they need more water, so they lose weight. And we didn't know this until about 2010, when some experimental studies were done. But they're very fussy eaters, and they have to be, because they can't be taking in plants high in potassium either. And so they don't eat shrubs. They don't eat the leaves of a shrub unless it's one of these that's an annual or a biennial, like apricot mallow. But they have to avoid plants that are high in potassium. And so they are very selective. And I recognized right away that the vegetation was changing. And when the sheep are put out, they're coming out just at the time the tortoises are emerging from brumation or hibernation, whichever word you prefer. And they literally clean the ground. I don't know if you've ever followed sheep or the cattle around, but they eat. They're going to start with the annuals, the things that the tortoises eat before they go to the shrubs. And so I noticed that right away. The off-road vehicle issue was a big one from the very beginning. It's one of the reasons the sheep and the off-road vehicle recreation users were driving literally everywhere on public and private land. And they were causing a lot of damage. I don't know whether you have studied this or whether you have any issues like this in Georgia, but it's a huge issue in the West.
Yeah,
And,
sort of.
and they compact the soil, so what's going to grow there are the weeds, the grasses. And then if the grass densities are high, then the fire becomes a problem, and the desert had not evolved with fire. And when the desert burns, it goes back to a Mediterranean grassland. So it's severely altered. You may wish to read about the Red Cliffs Reserve in Utah. It's a beautiful place with the red stone background, and 41% of that has burned. And it's burned from lightning, from vandalism, from teenagers starting fires, and from car fires that have spread. And so the non-native grasses are a very serious situation for maintaining good tortoise habitat.
I've spent some time tracking tortoises in that region of sort of southwestern Utah. And you mentioned earlier the differences in ecology. I mean, the tortoises there, that's a unique extension of the sort of northeasternmost Mojave Desert. And it's a very different habitat than what it is in Southern California. But it seemed like some of the Agassiz in that region were actually fairly commonly found on mesas and the sides of cliffs, maybe more similar to the Sonoran desert tortoises. I mean, is that something that's been documented, or am I not looking at that the right way?
You're looking at it the right way. I don't think a comparative study has been done. I know Anne McCluckey, who's the expert on the Red Cliffs animals and the Beaver Dam Slope animals, has pointed out that they thought they had separated some of the released animals by putting them in a place where they would have to climb a cliff to get to the top and get into an area where they weren't counting on having them. And lo and behold, the tortoises did it. And I think that's one thing that's absolutely fascinating about the animal is you think you know it, and you think after studying it for years and reading about it that you know something about it. Well, you're going to be surprised. Every now and then you're going to get a really big surprise.
Yeah, I remember we went out. That's who I was with was Anne McCluckey when we surveyed, and we had to climb the side of a big boulder with a rope and kind of hoist ourselves up. And right when we got to the top of this mesa, there was a tortoise sitting right there, just looking at us like, "Why was this so hard for you guys?" It was quite the experience. But maybe we could talk a bit about the Desert Tortoise Research Natural Area and the history of that. I mean, you're the one that sort of set all of that in motion, which is really cool. And there was recently a publication that was a really cool thing that you co-authored with some other folks looking at how the tortoises are faring in there compared to other places. And I'm curious, sort of, given the past history there with disease and that sort of thing, I mean, how are they doing now, and how does it compare to other locations?
Well, the fence has really made a difference, because if you get up in the air and you compare inside and outside the fence, you'll see some really big differences. The habitat is quite fragmented outside. There are vehicle trails everywhere, and camping sites where the ground has been scoured of vegetation. And I think having that fence was very, very important. Now, I know how well they were doing up to 2012. That was the last major study. It's next year, we will be looking at the entire natural area and the adjacent critical habitat, the designated critical habitat unit called the Fremont-Kramer unit. And we'll be doing hectare plots rather than mark recapture, because we'll be choosing random hectare plots. And there'll be 90 inside the natural area, and in the extensive area outside in critical habitat, there'll be well over, I think, 190, something like that. We're in the process of laying out the locations of all the hectare plots right now. So we'll have a better idea if the natural area is holding its own. There is chronic upper respiratory tract disease, but that's present throughout the western and eastern Mojave deserts. It's not so common in the Colorado or western Sonoran Desert of California. But that is present, and I think that it does add to a higher death rate for animals that have been ill for a long time.
Do you see a lot of shell disease in that general region, or where is shell disease most prominent?
Shell disease is most prominent in the eastern part of the Mojave Desert and also in the Colorado Desert. And there may be a linkage with the World War II training area of General Patton. He trained the troops for the entry into North Africa and into Europe in the desert. And he trained over 1 million soldiers. They had numerous camps. They had areas where they were shooting munitions, but it was a lot of tank traffic. They were teaching them to use tanks and vehicles in a desert setting. And there's batteries left, there's munitions left. That's where the shell disease is most prominent, is in the Colorado Desert, and where General Patton trained troops. And what we know from shell disease is that, and we've gradually learned this, it's the shell disease itself is an outward manifestation of metabolic disease, where organs are atrophying and are in very poor condition. And for the animals that we have salvaged because they were dying or in extremely poor condition, and we've looked at the livers, kidneys, and scutes, there are a number of heavy metals and other non-essential metals that are found in those organ systems.
When it comes to the shell disease, I think it's easy to think that it could just be external factors that lead to the sort of the foothold of the disease in the tortoise. But how much of the disease is actually from sort of internal issues already sort of manifesting in that in the actual shell necrosis?
Well, I think those are really good questions, and that they could be best answered experimentally. One of the actions that Dr. Bruce Homer, who is the pathologist for us, he was at that time at the University of Florida, had said if we could only take some of these animals with the shell disease into the lab, into captivity, into a place in the desert, and then feed them a good diet, a really good diet, would that change? Would the shell disease go away? We did see some shell disease in juveniles, and that particular juvenile had a high level of lead in its system. So we don't have the answer to that. What is the cause? For sure, we've got associations. Now, at your university, you've had in the past graduate students, I think one by the name of Haskins, who worked on the effects of selenium on one of the turtles. And if it is possible to give different dosages of selenium or a heavy metal or whatever to a turtle, then one would see is shell disease going to appear or what's going to happen. But then one has to be able to sacrifice those animals. And so with the desert tortoise, were really constrained to do that sort of thing. And I'd certainly be loath to kill an animal, especially an adult.
Right. Yeah, that's the one of the challenges of studying disease is, how do you study something internal without really sacrificing the organism, that's a tough call to make.
There's some thought that similar information can be obtained from blood and from, say, clippings of the scute or the shell. That's still to be determined. And in that case, one would still need to look at the kidneys and livers and set up a control study. But that's like a forensic pathologist and trying to solve some of these issues, and they're not easy.
Right. Sort of another question for a future student and sort of a topic to look at, or just anyone interested, I guess, that wants to undertake it. When in the process of, I remember this at least from going out to the DTRNA, was the fact that there's a lot of land disputes, and the way the land is distributed and who owns it is kind of convoluted. What have been some of the most memorable situations related to acquiring land or sort of making the preserve what it is today that come to mind with respect to just working with locals and sort of how does the land dynamic work there?
Well, that's very interesting, and if one knows the history of the Bureau of Land Management and the history of the land office, the general land office going back to the 1800s, the railroads were encouraged to come west by promising them every other section, every other square mile of land for quite a distance from the railroad path. Or they were given blocks of land in sort of a 30-60% pattern. It's called a braided pattern. There was the checkerboard and then the braided pattern. And that, the railroad has gradually sold off its parcels. And that has led to the land being subdivided for sale to actually new immigrants to the country and to people in Hawaii. There are whole blocks of land that were sold to people in Hawaii or in deep Los Angeles. And they were sold a bill of goods that they would make money. That they didn't realize, of course, they were going to have to pay taxes every year. And it's been difficult. The Desert Tortoise Preserve Committee sends out letters on a regular basis to the landowners asking if they would like to either donate or sell. And that's how the land is picked up. We used to be able to get it at a tax sale on the court steps in Bakersfield. And so people hadn't been paying for their taxes for a while. The land was sold on the court steps. And if one went there with cash or a check or whatever, one could get those parcels. One of the exciting things that happened was there was on the very northwestern part of the natural area, there was land owned by the Southern Pacific. And early on, with the help of the Nature Conservancy, the Desert Tortoise Preserve Committee acquired those lands. Southern Pacific gave it at a very low price. And so we have, the exciting thing for me was it enabled acquiring access to the adjacent Fremont Valley. It also provided a habitat that was rugged with rolling hills and canyons, and the tortoises were occupying those areas. And there were large washes or drainages, stream channels, ephemeral stream channels where there was a good food supply. So I was really glad when we were able to acquire that. And the Desert Tortoise Preserve Committee then turned those parcels over to the Bureau of Land Management for money that they could use to buy more land. So it was one of the very early programs in California for acquiring land. You'd acquire it and then you'd sell it to the agency that was supposed to be protecting the desert tortoise research natural area. And then we could pick up more of the little parcels that were owned by individuals.
And that's still sort of an ongoing battle, right?
It's ongoing. It's ongoing, yes.
Yeah. I remember there was maybe 6 or 7 years ago, I was tagging along that we were kind of restoring things and going on those surveys, and we ran into someone out there that had a motor home that they had accidentally, they had mistaken where their land was, and they were living out there. And it was a whole, the guy was a character, Lord Spud, and is like Fair Maiden or whatever. And it was just this whole ordeal that was really entertaining. But yeah, it just kind of went to show that it's pretty complicated out there in terms of land rights and where the boundaries are, that sort of thing.
It's gotten more so with the marijuana issue and the cartels. There are at least 3 cartels operating in the Mojave and Colorado Desert, and they are out there clearing land that isn't theirs often, and they are setting up marijuana fields and greenhouses. And so the Desert Tortoise Council Symposium featured several experts on that topic a couple of years ago. And it's a very serious issue. They are dangerous. These people are very dangerous, and they're carrying heavy weapons, and they don't want to be disturbed. They don't want anybody in the vicinity of their operation.
Have you had any close calls in the field working with the tortoises?
I've had breakdowns of my car and ridden into where I could make a phone call with the sheepmen. And I think the worst situation is when you get 2 flats.
Two simultaneously, or in a or at different times?
Within a very short time, and you haven't been able to get back. You haven't had the time. It's only been a few hours to get back and get your flats repaired or get a new tire.
Yeah, that's got to be frustrating. Yeah.
No, I have thought the desert was a fairly safe place to work until the marijuana issues. Most people are polite, and they want to be helpful, even though they may be carrying a gun or shooting or whatever. So I've been asked that question before. However, when I've been working in the desert and there's been a person, a transient, walking along a highway, miles, 30, 50 miles from any town, I'm certainly going to stay out of sight. I don't want to engage with the unknown.
Yeah, you never know. Yeah, right. It's good to be safe. When it comes to maybe we could talk about the evolution of desert tortoises. I mean, they're a species that's in a fairly turtle depauperate region. There's not a lot of, compared to the east coast of the U.S., the southeastern turtle diversity hotspot. West Coast is sort of fewer species. And why is it? I mean, are they sort of pre-adapted for the desert, or did they evolve to sort of deal with arid conditions?
I think I think you may have looked at the paper that I wrote with Dr. Moravka, David Moravka, and one of the hypotheses is that they were flexible enough that they could occupy deserts as well as tropical forests and that sort of situation. And if one looks across the globe, there are tortoises in arid and semi-arid areas, as well as in forested and chaparral communities. I think now's the time to talk about adaptations.
Yeah.
How does an animal like the tortoise survive in an arid situation. And well, there are behavioral and physiological adaptations, and we can talk about the easiest one is living in a burrow and spending 90% to 95% of one's life inside a burrow, deep in a burrow, to avoid the extremes in temperature and the lack of water, and also protection from predators. So that's an obvious one. The amount of time that is spent may not be, but it's a lot. When they come out, and then they do what they're going to do, and then they retreat. The physiological ones are fascinating. They can hold in their blood and in their bladder high concentrations of waste materials, potassium, sodium, and so on. And they can, at probably a higher concentration than most other animals. And so they temporarily hold it. And I should say temporarily hold it because they're in this boom bust situation with water, with rain, and also with forage. So when it rains, they come out and they go to a site that they know where water collects, or they have excavated a depression, and they will drink and they will void. They'll empty their bladder at the same time. But they drink, and they drink by sucking water up through the nares. And they can get that blood back into balance pretty quickly. And the bladder can be filled with dilute urine. So the point is, this keeps going on and on and on. It's when there's the rain, and when the rain causes the flowers to germinate, and then there's a food supply. They're doing very well, but by the end of the spring, they're building up those waste materials in the blood and in the bladder. And so hopefully there'll be a summer rain or one in the fall, and they'll come out in the cold of winter to drink. So those are some very interesting adaptations to live in the desert. And then this other one I mentioned earlier about selecting foods that are low in potassium, because potassium takes a lot of water to get rid of. So how did they do it? That's a big question. Did they start off as a hatchling, as a little tortoise, and if they have a bad experience with eating something, that they then get wise, or is this built in? Did this evolve with them, and that there's a certain taste? It's just all speculation on my part, but they do it. They select these foods, and they will eat the grass only when there's nothing else to eat. And then, of course, that causes its problems too. The females, they're generating the yolks in the fall, and they can resorb the yolks before they're shelled in the spring, and not use them if there's a couple of years of drought, or they'll only lay a couple of eggs. They'll lay a much smaller clutch than they would otherwise. So that's an adaptation too that's very important. There's one that I think is important, and that is the separation between the time the female is nesting and the time that courtship occurs. Because the male courtship is very aggressive, and the males are very aggressive during the courtship season, and they will flip a female. They will cause her to fall down a slope. That's been observed. And so females can get, when they're jostled like that, they can get egg yolk peritonitis. And so by separating the courtship and the nesting period, I think that's another adaptation. The courtship period is in the summer, the hot summer, and the early fall. And nesting is in the spring.
I've heard that they also have the ability to resorb water back into the bladder and potentially kidneys for refiltration. I don't know, though, how well documented that is or the specific dynamics of that.
Neither do I. I understand that that has been said, and that fresh water can be taken out of the bladder and used to dilute waste in the blood. But I don't know how that occurs. I don't know the mechanisms. And Dr. Ken Nagy might be the best person to speak with on that subject.
Yeah, he would be another great guest at some point. I'll have to, yeah, for sure. And when you're thinking about, there's some African tortoise species that I know they don't actually, even when they do have access to water, they don't drink from standing water for the most part, unless it's raining and copious because of the toxins that build up in where the water sort of deposits. Is that the case with desert tortoises in certain times of the year, or is that not? Is there too much water in their range that it's not really a problem?
Well, the water that falls within their range is rainwater. And so they have to devise a method to get that rainwater and to drink it. And that's why they dig depressions, or they know where those depressions are. They may be a depression that they created. There may be a place on a rock. I've seen one up on a boulder drinking out of a depression in the boulder. And that was something I learned very, very early in the 1970s, because I was out in August and I'd seen these scratchings along the edge of boulders. And it started to rain, and I went to the burrows where they were. They weren't at their burrows. And so I started looking at the places where I'd seen some sign like this, and they were out drinking.
It's fascinating. And yeah, there's maybe some of these places in Africa, I think that the rainfall is very limited, and it's sort of that water pools for years, and it's really not usable. But it seems like Mojave has a little bit more widely accessible. The rainfall is a little more consistent, so they can sort of use that.
Well, then I think that it's just falling on the ground, and so they've got to pick it up from the ground. Now, I did see a juvenile trying to get the drops of rain that fell on a creosote limb. So the shrub was dripping, and the juvenile was reaching up and getting the droplets of water.
Interesting. With respect to juveniles and just population demographics, what are juvenile and young tortoises doing? I mean, you don't really find them that frequently. Where are they hanging out?
They are almost exclusively using burrows. in the large shrubs. And they may start, and what I'm telling you is from a paper I published last year on 9.5 years of studying released head-started tortoises and tracking them. We tracked about 120 juveniles, and we had greatest success at one site where we had, I think, 78 or 80. And so when they're first released, they're going and they're looking for a spot to have a burrow. And the coppice mound of a creosote bush, the creosote bushes are the largest shrubs in the western desert, they have a lot of rodent holes. Do you know what a coppice mound is? It's developed by the leaves falling from the creosote bush and then sand collecting and building up. And so the mound, there may be a mound underneath the creosote bush that's raised, and it's got much softer sand than in the surrounding area. And so we released the juveniles in a coppice mound where there were rodent burrows and abandoned rodent burrows. And so the really small ones go after digging right away and getting into a burrow. It's a very rapid process for them because they do need to have a burrow, or there's the recognition of the animal that they need to have a burrow. The larger ones dig their own. And so they're staying very close to those burrows. They may take loop trips out from them and exploratory trips. But for the most part, they stay within a small home range. And that home range gets bigger as they grow. And when they get into an immature size, about 140 to 150 millimeters, that's a large immature, then they start expanding that home range, and they may be traveling and they may disappear, or they may get themselves into trouble by getting caught in a tight situation with rocks where they can't get out. We've had to rescue some, and or going where they don't, getting out on the highway, the road. So it's something that comes with time, but they're solitary. They are not sharing burrows with other tortoises. When I say solitary, I mean they're not sharing burrows with other tortoises. I have a paper that will be published in July in Chelonian Conservation and Biology on the solitary young tortoise. It's only when they become adults that they're sharing burrows.
Do you find any interesting social interactions between either juveniles and adults or juveniles and other juveniles, or do they kind of just do their own thing and not really cross paths much?
Well, we did observe an aggressive behavior at a burrow. A larger tortoise, an large immature, approached a burrow that young tortoise was excavating and drove it off, took over the burrow for a few days and then left. And neither of them went back to that site. So there is aggression early on.
It's really interesting. And so you've touched upon this a bit, the foraging dynamics, and again, the desert is the habitats are sort of complex, and patchily distributed, and you'll see these areas of wildflowers where the soil is conducive to it for whatever reasons, and the tortoises seem to sort of congregate in those areas. Are they, when they're foraging in those patches, and are they picking out certain flowers? I mean, are they discriminating between things, and are they herding or solitary and flocking towards that resource?
There may be, let's give the example of the lotus. Tortoises really like members of the legume family. And when they have a choice, they're going to take more bites of legumes like lotus and milk vetches in the genus or local weeds. Anything that is a pea, member of the bean or pea family, they go after. And the lotus tends to grow in patches. And so one can see a number of adults approaching those patches.
Very interesting. Sort of one more general ecology question, and then we can kind of move to some future directions and sort of start to wrap things up. Something I remember from reading in a variety of papers and just over time is that a lot of times sort of a variable that is looked at for where tortoises and linking tortoise abundance and trying to figure out what environmental or anthropogenic variables influence where tortoises are distributed. One thing that's looked at a lot is trash, and how trash is sort of linked to tortoise abundance. And it seems like it's sort of a variable response. Certain studies find tortoises in higher densities where there's more trash, and certain studies find lower densities. I mean, what's going on there?
I would have to look at each situation. We do collect data on trash, and we identify what kind of trash it is, whether it's a balloon, and tortoises will eat balloons. And this is a serious issue because it can block the digestive tract. And they're close to human use. There are a lot of the balloons, and there's a lot of trash. In the area where General Patton worked, there's a lot of trash, old cans, and situations like that. Now, I don't know of any situation of where they congregate around trash. I think that would be a high risk. But what I do know is there are examples where water is collected on a piece of sheet metal that was just left out in the desert. And tortoise knows that this is a good drinking spot. And so it goes to that area to drink. And out in the Chuckwallas, I was out working on anthropogenic impacts at one of my study sites, and there was a can of the age of the Patton period and bent, and there was a baby tortoise in it waiting for the rain. And it smelled like rain. It was going to rain, and it did rain, and the little tortoise was waiting there in the can, just sitting in that crease. And I thought that was interesting. How early or when did it learn that that's where the water collected? And that's another question that would be of interest.
Yeah, sort of tortoise intelligence and memory, that sort of thing. It's kind of a different than human thought, but in what ways, it's an interesting thing to think about. How do they think?
And they have memories. They know where the males know where the females are, and they know where an aggressor is, or one that when they are up to fighting. and they want to engage with another tortoise, they will go to that site. So they have a good brain for the kind of situation that they're in. Excuse me.
Right.
Pug is beating his foot on my desk.
Well, maybe we can sort of kind of bring things back to the conservation perspective and looking forward. I'm curious from your perspective as someone who's worked with desert tortoises for so long. And now considering, I mean, it's interesting because when you started, I mean, they were a single species, and now you've got all this recognized diversity, even beyond just the specific level. I mean, you have management units and haplotypes, all of that kind of thing. But what are the biggest threats facing desert tortoises in general and at any scale?
Humans and human activity. Certainly climate change is going to have an effect, maybe having an effect, but that is coming slower than this huge wave of the human footprint. Human footprint looms large on the habitat of the desert tortoises.
Right. And yeah, it's sort of the ones causing the negative change. We can also be the ones to fix it, potentially. I mean, what do you think about what are the prospects for the future of the species?
Well, I like to say that we can put a man on the moon, and why can't we fix some of these really serious situations we have with federally threatened and endangered species? And there's certainly an effort. Whether it's successful or not remains to be seen. Yeah, the management, if one looks closely at management plans and actions to be undertaken, one has to check to see how many of those actions have been implemented and then implemented successfully.
And there have been a lot of different conservation action plans for the desert tortoises. And I mean, that history is, there are a lot of, compared to a lot of turtles, a lot of people and tortoises and sort of all Chelonians, a lot of people are looking at and studying desert tortoises. And I think it seems like it gets kind of convoluted sometimes with all of the different proposals and such. I mean, what's gone into the plans that have been produced that are successful versus those that have failed?
I think finally there are some successes with the ravens, but there's oiling of the eggs of the ravens in an attempt to keep the numbers from growing. But there's still large areas with huge flocks of ravens. And so a step has been taken that's been successful. And the goal is to reduce where the footprint of the raven on the critical habitats of the tortoise.
When we talk about the threat of ravens to our tortoises, is managing them more a response to the raven threat being elevated due to human activity, or is it something that we're just doing because it's always been this way, but now that tortoises are vulnerable, we have to assist them?
It's human activity has supported the ravens. It supported them with food and water year round. And so the populations have been able to grow enormously. And they're continuing to grow. And I've got come here. Just settle down. Excuse me for a minute. Let's just
We have a visitor.
Yeah. Well, it's his lunchtime, and so
Oh, he's getting
he's
antsy.
telling me it's time that I have to feed him. So I think that there's continually new issues like the marijuana. And there are issues like the off-road vehicles that are not controlled. And that has not been a successful attempt, or let's say we've not been successful in confining them to their play areas or to the authorized routes. We also have the new threats with new invasive plants. The Brassica tournefortii, the Sahara mustard, is a really serious issue. And it's spreading throughout the Mojave, and it's going to be competing with the annuals that the tortoises eat. And it's not a good food supply for the tortoise. So the solar development is largely bordering the critical habitat or outside it. There's some of it that has occurred in tortoise habitat, but not in the critical habitat. And with that comes more roads, routes, and weeds. So the military expansion has been another one, and that's continuing. And it's expanding into some of the good habitats, really good tortoise habitat.
Out of all the places that you've worked with desert tortoises, where's been the most fulfilling or interesting?
I think the study of the social behavior in the Soda Mountains was very, very fine. Just being out day after day and watching them, watching how they live, and to some extent getting into their thought processes. Because if you knew if they were going to go to a particular burrow at the base of a big wash, then that male was going to cross the wash and go over and visit a female that was on the other side of the wash. So there was an intent. There is an intent in what they do.
Right.
And they are very different in terms of personalities.
And sort of as our two kind of wrap up questions, I guess, when you're thinking about, why should people care about desert tortoises?
Well, they're a flagship species. They're iconic. They're at the top of the herbivore food chain in the valleys and the fans of the desert. And they're an umbrella species. If you take good care of the habitat where the tortoises live, most of the other animals are going to thrive. So they're very important in that regard. And there are those that say, well, so what if we lose a species? Well, we're going to lose more than the species. The tortoise burrows are used by all kinds of individual animals and different species, birds, reptiles, snakes, and so on. And burrowing owls don't dig their own holes. And so their homes are home for a lot of other species. They're very important to the ecosystem.
Yeah, just broadly, sort of engineers and, as you've mentioned, umbrella species, and can be this meter for how the entirety of the system is faring. It's really an interesting and cool thing as sort of a monitor. And then sort of as our last thing that is interesting for us as students, but a lot of people that listen to the podcast too are younger. As someone who's had a successful career working with tortoises, what is one or multiple pieces of advice you would give to someone who's looking to make turtle work sort of a career?
Well, I would be as broad in your education as possible, and be prepared to move from one area of field, such as the health and disease, to genetics, and to intensive modeling. And this means one works with teams, because one's expertise is not in all areas. And so the ability to work with other people and to enjoy working with other people and with difficult personalities on occasion, it's quite important. And I would take courses in superficial geology so that you know what kind of geology you're in, and that helps in turn with the soils and the structure of the land. If your area of interest in turtles is with turtles that eat insects, then entomology. And if they're herbivores, learn the vegetation. What are they eating? And is it their choice, or is it the leftovers because of the change in the land? And so really need to look very closely too at disturbance, and become a disturbance ecologist, because some animals thrive in disturbance and some don't. And I think for those working with aquatic species, it's essential that you get in and learn about the measurements of the quality of the water. So there's just so much exciting work to be done.
Right. And yeah, so I think that's really holistic advice and interesting for us, and like sort of like look into the areas that are tangentially related or part of your study with the tortoises or the turtles, and become more of an overall expert, I guess, and to some extent.
A surface expert, so you know where to find the information, so that you know whether the work has been done, and if it hasn't, who can you tap for help?
Right.
So,
Well, we'll take it to heart, and for those listening, I think, yeah. Well, we'd like to finish off. If you've got to go, we understand, but we'd like to finish off with a quick round of turtle trivia. Usually, but I don't know if you've got a turtle trivia question.
I have something for you.
Okay.
The desert tortoise male, during the breeding season, between July and October, very late July, it's actually that builds up, but the testosterone levels higher than any known vertebrate. And
Wow.
they are very, very aggressive. I can't begin to emphasize how aggressive they are. And and that includes humans. They have the higher testosterone level at that period in their lives than humans. And to watch them during the summer is really something, because whether there's drought or they've had a good year, they're going to be out, and they're going to be working on beating up their neighbors. And size is everything. But if you've had your gular horn damaged by a dog or some other animal, or you have a cracked shell because you've fallen off a rocky area or been hit by a car and survived, you're not going to do as well. And that's something we see. You could be a big animal and you're just not going to make it. You can't fight the way you need to fight to be successful. But being a big guy and being top of the rock, so to speak, isn't everything, because the little males are often can be more favored by the females.
Interesting. So it's not always being the most aggressive that sort of wins that battle. That's interesting.
Yeah, there's the sneaky males, or what are called the sneaky males, because the big males can't be everywhere at once defending the females.
I know sometimes the males will get so aggressive they'll go after field biologists. I mean, have you ever been charged by a male tortoise?
No, I've had them come sit in my lap, but I discourage that kind of thing. That was early on, but we try to make sure they don't touch our clothes or
right.
pack or anything like that.
Well, that's really interesting. I did not realize that it's the highest among vertebrates. Kind of scary, but interesting as well.
Well, maybe not all the animals have been tested. And maybe there's some out there, some turtles out there that will beat that.
Turtles could be a good place to start looking for that sort of information. Yeah, right. Well, this has been awesome.
Yeah, really nice speaking with you.
Yeah, and same to you as well. I mean, it's an honor to be able to talk with you about your incredible career with these animals and all the work that you've done. It's really inspiring to us. So thank you.
Well, I have to tell you that I still have that drive and I still have that curiosity. It hasn't gone away. So it will be here until I can no longer work.
Yeah, it's incredible. And for us and students, it would be successful if we could accomplish half of what you have and try to carry through that spirit and enthusiasm for the animals.
Well, I also have other work that I do too on Joshua trees and on plants. So when the situation is feeling bleak with the tortoises, I have other options too to enjoy. And I think that's very important too.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. Well, thank you, Dr. Berry, for sitting down with us today. If there's any last thoughts that you want to have, now's the time. If not, we'll finish this one off.
I think I'm done.
All right.
And I appreciate the invitation very much, and I hope that you, Michael, and Paul have a wonderful career. Don't ever give up. You can get discouraged, but you just plow on. And I hope you get some good jobs, really good jobs, but you may have to take some awful ones before the good ones come. I think I was in my 40s before and approaching 50 before I was really able to do what I wanted to do. So.
Well, thanks for the advice. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you and goodbye.
Bye.
Yeah.